Now then, how you doing? I hope you're well. Let's just suppose you've never painted in watercolour before, ever, and want to learn how to do it. Well, what would be the first things you'd want to know about? A few basic pointers might be useful. Having some paints is a good idea, and so is having a brush. Which paints and which brush though? You might also be asking, which paper should I buy? There's so much to choose from. So here's my first tip: buy within your budget. Trust me, you don't need the most expensive brushes or paints in the shop. If you're just starting out, aim for something mid-range. Well, most importantly, make sure you're buying a watercolour brush, not one designed for oils. Well, they can be synthetic and don't have to be the finest sable. This is the 21st century after all. Even low to mid-range brushes are generally better than they ever have been. We've never had it so good. But what about the paint? Again, buy within your budget and make sure you're buying watercolour, not gouache or acrylic. Another thing you may ask yourself is, should I be buying pans or tubes? It really doesn't matter. The truth is, it's the same stuff in them. Chances are though that you're probably more familiar with taking paint from a preloaded pot, what we call pans, so go with what feels right. Well, finally, paper. As with the brushes, make sure you're buying watercolour paper. It's made specifically for the job. Confusingly though, you will find it comes in different weights and surfaces. My recommendation would be to buy paper that is marked as being 140 pounds in weight, and if you're specifically interested in painting landscapes, buy rough. Whether it's in individual sheets or in a pad, it doesn't matter. So you've bought all this stuff. Where do you start? Well, try mixing some paint up with water and see what happens. The main thing is, don't be afraid of it. Paint mixing isn't a dark art. It's very simple really. Adding more water to it bulks it out, but it also lightens it. If you want to make it darker, simply add more pigment to it. It's as easy as that. Well, the important thing is play around with it, experiment, and always watch what happens on the paper. So I'm going to paint something quick and relatively simple for you in a moment, just to get you started and show what can be achieved with only 2 colours and a little patience. Before I do that though, let's just take a moment to recap on what I've just said about mixing paints and how the balance of the pigment to water mix affects how it looks on the paper. This is French ultramarine. It's looking relatively light due to there being a high proportion of water in the mix. If I add more paint to the mix though, let's see what happens. Adding water dilutes a mix and makes it lighter, while adding more paint to it intensifies it. You'll not be surprised then when I apply it to the paper that it looks darker. If you're new to watercolour, this is the sort of exercise you should be indulging in. Mix up paint, apply it to paper and watch what happens. A very simple first lesson to be learnt then is that we control the lightness or darkness of a colour by altering the balance between paint and water. And while we're at it, let's just see what happens when we apply clean water from a damp brush to the bottom of the 3 shapes I've just painted. Because my board is set at a gentle angle, which is something I recommend you should always be doing, the paint flows downwards into the damp area and softens the bottom edges of the shapes off. It's a quick, simple way to create soft edges and also to create some degree of graduation. I'll say it again, allow yourself the freedom to experiment with your paint and always watch what happens on the paper. In watercolour, we're either applying paint to dry paper, which creates hard edges, or to damp or wet paper, which creates soft edges. Depending upon the scene, we might be aiming for a flat, consistent finish, or to make things more visually interesting, we might prefer our colour to graduate, as it's doing here. I've applied French ultramarine in long, broad strokes to a damp surface. Again, with the board set at a gentle angle, it means the paint will naturally flow downwards. It's also worth saying that while things are still damp, the wash can more easily be modified. For example, here I'm going over it again to make it a little stronger, and because the surface is damp, I have the luxury of being able to push the paint around and try and make it do what I want it to. Another lesson very quickly learnt in watercolour is that timing is crucial. When a wash is almost dry, or it may feel dry on the surface but still be damp beneath it, it's at a critical stage. That's often the point where things start to go pear-shaped. Bring too much excess water to an almost dry wash and you'll probably end up with unsightly cauliflowers, technically known as backruns. Having blasted it with a hairdryer, the wash is now bone dry, which means that if I now apply further paint to it, that's more French ultramarine you see me using here, the shape it creates will have hard edges. Again, if you're completely new to watercolour, then I recommend keeping things as simple as possible. I'm imagining a simple line of hills, for instance. Nothing too extravagant or complicated. It could just as easily be a city skyline or a bunch of farm buildings. Take your choice, but keep it simple. To make things a little more interesting, my line of hills is going to represent a coastline with a rather non-specific ruined building perched on the furthest reaches of the headland. Probably something Cornish, like an old tin mine, for example. So, if you've never painted in watercolour before and this was your first time, what are the things you need to know? Applying paint to dry paper creates different results to when we apply it to damp paper. We control the intensity of our mix by adding more pigment or water, and timing is crucial. Here, a slightly darker mix of French ultramarine enables me to create the illusion of a second layer of hills in front of the first. By doing so, it's pushed the first shape backwards, helping to create the illusion of depth and space. I'm going to add a third layer of hills in a moment, but first let's do something vaguely interesting to the foreground. Painting the hills onto a dry surface has ensured they finish up with hard edges. That makes sense if we're aiming for good, clear definition. We don't want fuzzy hills. If this is meant to be the sea or a lake in the foreground though, a looser, softer edged approach might suit it better. So, to achieve this, I've re-wet the paper in that area with a damp brush, and I'm simply dropping the French ultramarine into it. Again, remember my board is set at a gentle angle, so the paint will not only have soft edges, but it will also have a tendency to flow downwards. Well, it's a simple demonstration that could use some finesse, but I hope it helps to convey the two subtly different but important scenarios in which we apply paint. Which brings me to the third and final act. Another important thing anyone starting out in this medium needs to know is that in watercolour we work from light to dark. Well, for my final layer then, I've added some burnt umber to the French ultramarine to create a slightly different colour, a more neutral looking blue-grey, if you will. Well, by being darker, the third layer of hills looks closer to us, while the two previous layers look slightly further away. It's to be remembered that in watercolour we work on a flat two-dimensional surface, so three-dimensionality is never going to be anything more than an optical illusion. Manipulating tonal values like this is just one of the many ways in which we can reinforce that illusion. Well, I hope some of that may have been useful to you. If you're just starting out in watercolour, then you're probably finding it a bit of a minefield and can use all the help you can get. Well, I'm sure you'll not be surprised though when I tell you the way to learn is through practice and perseverance. Well, I'm going to be back with more watercolour basics very soon, so if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and if you've not already done so, please consider subscribing to my channel. Well, more in-depth guidance and advice is of course available through my online tuition service. Details of how to subscribe to that are in the description below. In the meantime, keep watching what happens on the paper and enjoy. Till the next time, take care.